Good morning. This is the first and only time I'll be in a pulpit, I can assure you of that. Welcome to the Mullen Lecture. For those of you who don't know, Don Mullen was an accomplished cardiologist, an extraordinary doctor, and in a trip back from Kenya, he had an epiphany or an awakening, and he realized that he should do more than that. He continued practicing medicine until the early 90s when he stopped at 45 and went to the Princeton Seminary and became a preacher. And he was our preacher, associate pastor here, and then interim preacher here in the 2000-2012 period. However, in the time he went to the Princeton Seminary and to the time he came here, he spent 15 to 20 years treating people. He was a medical missionary, an extraordinary guy. His family created this lecture for you. The other extraordinary person is Dr. Max Miller. He comes from a little town in Mississippi, went to Millsaps College, a place I don't know much about, graduated, which is a good thing in Mississippi, got a PhD in Emory, eventually went back to Emory and ran the PhD program for almost 30 years. He retired from that and decided he was bored, so he became the archaeologist for the Fern Bank in Atlanta. But the good part is that after college, Max took his gap year, or at least his gap months, and went to the European continent, but ended up in the Middle East. And he's been back over 50 to 70 times in the last 10 to 15 years of your life. He's an extraordinary expert on the Middle East itself, and that includes not only Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt. He's been as far east as Iraq, I believe, before it changed, maybe even Iran, Turkey, and all the way around. And he is an extraordinary expert on this. I was privileged to go to Palestine and Israel with him a couple of years ago. Kathy and I went on a trip. When we would get to a place of importance, he would start with the Greeks, then go to the Romans, and then go to the Muslims, and then go to the Jews, or whatever the order was for that particular place, reminding us that the people in that part of the world have been there forever. He's a little bit intrepid. He also helped do an archaeological survey of the Moab region, which is in Jordan, for 4 years. And he hasn't stopped leading church preachers to Israel and Palestine, to the Holy Land, as a balance to some of the preachers who get carried away. He tells them exactly what happened and where. They may say that Jesus walked on this water. He said, no, may have been a little other place in the river, but not here. And to make sure that you think he's retired, he took his grandson on a trip to to Mongolia, and one of the modes of transportation was a camel for more than one day, except for his camel got scared by a dog, dumped him on the ground, broke a couple of ribs, but he still kept going because there's no ambulances and there's no hospitals in the Gobi Desert. So with no further ado, he is an extraordinary resource, and here we go. Max?
Thank you, George. Now, that sounds amazing. If you let me warn you, though, if you try to Google me to see if all that's true, that's not my phone. Thanks. See if all that's true, let me warn you. There's more than one Max Miller that writes books. And if it gets out of my zone, really, if I have any area of expertise, it's on history and archaeology of biblical times, ancient times. If it gets very far away from that zone, it may not be me. Okay? We'll talk about the Arab-Israeli situation this morning. And one thing I want to say in advance, if you have it figured out, or even if you get it figured out during the course of my presentation, which side are the good guys and which side are the bad guys, you probably are not listening closely or certainly not up to date on all the information. In my opinion, this is just one of those complex human situations that we get into when we organize ourselves into group and push and shove for space and advantage in the world. And when I'm running through here this morning, just some of the highlights that lead up to the present, maybe among things we can talk about at the end, is talking about parallels between our own history in the United States and what we were doing with our native population at the age of Israel. Okay? And I'm also going to stand over here, and I may move around a little bit until I can get my glasses in focal length with the screen so I can see it as well. This story has to begin with the end of the Ottoman Empire, World War I, and the peace settlement that was made primarily by the British and French at the end of that war. British and French having to do with this Middle Eastern arena, which was former Ottoman territory. Best book on that that I know of is titled "The Peace to End All Peace." And it was hopefully certainly well titled, because it was a complicated thing from the beginning. Well, the Allies, Russia, of course, had just had its Bolshevik Revolution, so it was kind of out of the conversation at the moment. United States, Wilson was going in another direction. So basically, it was the French and the British to decide what to do now with former Ottoman territory that was now under their, decision to decide. So we're looking at just the part on the left map that's in the square, and I've blown it up on the eastern, on the right side there. And that's kind of basically the way the settlement began. It was agreed that France would take responsibility for the red part, which they call Syria, and then the British would have responsibility for the green part. Names like Iraq, a little different from Syria. Well, I'll get back to that in a minute. Anyhow, they have that whole green area. The eastern part, Iraq, they established a constitutional monarchy. That is, you got a king, but you're going to have something like a parliament, prime minister, and so forth. And they placed as king there a son of who had been the sheikh of Mecca before that. You know him better as Omar Sharif in the Lawrence of Arabia movie, if you saw that. And then the area east of the Jordan River. You can make it out there. Let me see if I can. You see the Jordan River right here. East became the Emirate of the Transjordan, and they placed that in the hands of Emir Abdullah. Abdullah was Faisal. I call him Sharif, but we're talking about Faisal. Older brother. So two brothers are going to be the king and then the prince of the Transjordan. The area west of the Jordan River, there was already a good deal of thought and lobbying to make that, or at least part of it, Jewish, or a kind of haven state for Jews, who, of course, already at that time were dealing with a great deal of just difficulties in Russia and in Europe. Let me note, too, before leaving here, that France did somewhat the same thing. There's a little part right here that is marked off. That whole Syria was almost entirely Sunni Muslim. But especially over in these hills were a good number of minorities that had retreated into those hills over the centuries, the largest of which were Maronite Christians, but a good number of other Christians as well. So what they are going to do is mark that off first as a district, while they are governing this area themselves as a mandate between World War I and World War II. But when they leave in 1946, after World War II, it becomes a separate nation of Lebanon. We were talking yesterday about Christians in the Middle East, and I mentioned Maronites. These would be the Maronites. And the government was such that they would have a majority there. Well, there was some thought of doing the same thing in the area that the British have, but instead they decide that they're going to administer this directly as a mandate, British administered government. Okay, now that's the same map. I'm going to map off then just the little part that the British have. And let's look now at the map on the right. You've got the Emirate of the Transjordan under Emir Abdullah, largely a Bedouin nation at this point. Most of this area, it looks like a lot of green, but most of that is you're moving into the desert to the east. And the region to the left, in kind of yellow or tannish, that is called Palestine. And between World War I and World War II, the British administer this directly. British governor, if you live there, whether you were Jewish, whether you were Arab, or whether you were whatever, your passport read Palestine. You were from Palestine. Now, that name Syria and Palestine, of course, the Turks who had already ruled this area had their own names for these different places. And the Arabs had and have their own names. But the people who are making these decisions and looking at maps and working from Paris in British, they didn't know much about that. Their training had been in the classics. So they go back to these old classical names. And that southern part of what had already been known in classical times as Syria, probably a derivative of Assyria, had come to be known as early as Herodotus as the Palestinian part of Syria, Palestina. And so they pick up, and that's how Palestine makes its way then very quickly into a modern map. Okay, between World War I and, wait a minute, I'm using a different pointer here that I'm familiar with, so give me a second. Now, just look at that same map again, but look over at the right. I want to just hit 2 or 3 things that have happened between World War I and World War II. First, there's that Balfour Declaration during World War I that kind of signals the British government is open to the notion of some kind of haven state for Jews. It didn't happen. There was a great deal of lobbying back and forth, but it didn't happen. During the 1930s, there was heavy Jewish population to Palestine. Remember what's going on in Europe. The Nazis are taking over in Germany. The Jews are trying to get anywhere they can go. And so many of them are coming there. By the mid-1930s, by 1936, the local Arabs are beginning to say, hey, wait a minute. The population here is changing. And by that time, you also have Jewish organizations, some of them militant, who are, make no bones about it. Yeah, we're going to make an Israeli state here. Now, if you've been in Florida and suddenly you've got Hispanics deciding they're going to block off part of Florida, you see, it's going to be a new Cuba or something like that, you probably get uneasy. And the Arabs do it by 1936. You have Arab uprisings, and it breaks into a pretty good rebellion. The British managed to kind of take down and hold down the problems through World War II. And there were Jewish militant groups also, especially the Irgun, that specialized in bombing British offices in Palestine because they wanted the British to get on out. The Stern Gang and various others. 1948, the British just essentially say, folks, we're out of here. We're going to leave on a certain date. Have at it. And they did, and they had at it, and things break into a war with Israelis called the War of Independence. And when the dust settled, the Jewish Israeli movement, let's call it, until the dust settles. When the dust settles, they have the pink. And so that becomes the new Israel. And on into 1949, they make armistice agreements with the surrounding Arab countries. But in the meantime, these Arab countries, you see, have attempted to stop them from coming into being, claiming, of course, and I'm sure there's some of the sentiment, these Palestinians are our Arab brothers here. But on the other hand, they also wanted to make sure they got in on the spoils as the British mandate of Palestine came unglued. But in the process of the fighting and so forth, you've got Arabs, Palestinians, who are fleeing in different directions to get out of the way of fighting. You've got them fleeing, watch my arrows, north into Lebanon, northeast into Syria, then many of them east into what is going to end up in Jordanian hands, and then down west into that little strip of land that's really, really purple on the map, but it should be just like Egypt is down here because it was in Egyptian hands, a little strip of territory around a major city of Gaza. So it's going to be the Gaza Strip. Now, though the Palestinians who did not leave or even left their own homes but remained inside what became Israel in 1948-49, they had a citizenship grandfathered in to Israel. So they become what the Israelis generally refer to them as Israeli Arabs. They more likely call themselves Palestinian Israelis, but those two names are the same. And it's something like, maybe 2 million of these. And I'm jumping ahead, but you can imagine it's going to be a somewhat second-class citizenship. But let's look and see what happens over here. Meanwhile, Emir Abdullah, who ends up controlling the West Bank. We understand what we're talking about, the West Bank here. This part right here. Israelis refer to it as Judea and Samaria, but the international terminology is West Bank. West Bank is the Jordan River here. That's actually in Jordanian hands still at the end of the fighting, and right after it, 1950, he annexes that to the emirate. But with the larger territory, he changes, upgrades the name of the Emirate of the Transjordan to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Hashemite, his family name that dates back to a companion with Muhammad. So very important in that regard. And also raised his own title, king. So King Abdullah, not everybody was happy with that, even within the Palestinian realm. And so he's assassinated when he goes into Al-Aqsa Mosque the next year. And his grandson, actually, is going to replace him fairly soon. Actually replaced by a son, but he got kind of out of the picture, the different twists on the story of how that happened. But my opinion is that he just was not pro-Egypt enough, not pro-British enough. You see, they are still British here, but the grandson was actually studying in England, and so all of you recognize, I think all of you, as I look around, are old enough to recognize that King Hussein was on our news a whole lot. So there we are. At the end of, we have now an independent Israel on the scene, and you have a good deal of refugees that move in different directions, but you have Palestinians with some citizenship inside. All right, let's think about the first 2 decades of Israel And the thing that locks off this decade at the end of it is the 6 Day War. That's a big game changer. You all remember that very well. Two important figures I'm just reminding you of because I'm looking at ages. Probably you're in high school, college, something like this when this is happening. Ben Gurion is the real leader of New Israel. He wasn't prime minister for the whole time, but off and on he was the key figure there. But the nemesis on the other side was Nasser. Now, the way we mentioned Egypt last, it really had been a kind of British protectorate. Khedives who had renamed themselves kings and continued through World War II. The last one was King Farouk. And so you have a group of Egyptian officers that overthrow him in 1952, 1953. Nasser comes to the head of these officers. His theme is pro-Arab. If all of us Arab countries get our act together, we can respond against these things we've had to put up with for the past decades while the British and French were controlling our region.
And we can start by this intrusive Jewish nation that they have put in our corner, push them into the sea. That, by the way, was when I first started coming through here. He mentioned shoestring out of college. I turned up in Egypt in 1960. And, fell in with young Egyptian fellows. And I can just tell you, he was the hero. In fact, I mentioned to one of them, I said, you kind of look like Nasser. Oh, that was really great. But he, remember, was beginning to maneuver militarily, placed troops already in the Sinai. And one morning, we're jumping ahead. I've come back home now, and other things have happened. Julene, for example. But it's 67. I'm about to go back to Israel on a second archaeological excavation. Had my ticket, and you remember that the Israeli Air Force wiped out the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, and then in 6 days had spread all through the green area that you see there. Suddenly, Israel has, under its military control, territory that is much larger than it was already. Now, remember that Sinai there are not many people there, so it's not. Don't let the color throw you off on population, but a much larger population that's under their control one way or another, and actually still is. And so you're moving into that situation there. Six-Day War. I'm sorry, I need to get a little bit closer here. Yeah, all right, the 6 Day War. Israel gains control of the Sinai, including Gaza, and also the West Bank, and also part of what was Syria at that time. And you will hear from time to time in current discussions, Resolution 242, United Nations, and that was the thinking, the United Nations at the end of the war, how to settle this thing. Israel should return the territory to the Arab countries that were now there, or had been there on the eve of the war, and they should in return recognize Israel as a nation and move forward with that peace. That was a real opportunity, but it didn't happen. I have to show these. I went on to that archaeological dig. I didn't turn in my ticket. The war was over in 6 days. I worked down in the Negev with an Israeli team, and with them I went over into Gaza. You see, just a few months, less than 2 months after the war. So I have to show these pictures that I took in Gaza at that time. Okay, enough of that. Moving to the early 70s. Into the early 70s, we've got three important figures we need to look at there. One, Golda Meir. You'll remember her as prime minister, and I think a very good prime minister. But a young fellow comes on the scene, Yasser Arafat. Arafat was Palestinian. There were now a good number of Palestinian parties or groups or movements or whatever that wanted to do different things in relation to the Palestinians, and most of them hoping somehow to recover their home area. The range from people who were working with the refugees, trying to get them food and water and that sort of thing, but also others such as Arafat, who were more interested in trying to do something militarily. Now, he was the head of one of these parties, Fatah. Fatah. You've been hearing that name, I'm sure. This is where it comes from. It's a party that emerged at that time. Now, in 1964, this Fatah party and these various other pro-Palestinian groups organized in what was something like a United Nations of Palestinian groups. And that broader organization was called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. The PLO. Now, Fatah, PLO, you can see they're kind of close there, but they're different. And Arafat is elected as head of the PLO. But now he's still, he's not just head of PLO, he's also active in his things. And he becomes the head of a military group that camps out or finds space in northern Kingdom of Jordan and operates guerrilla activities, sending over bombs and things like that to just create difficulties for the Israeli control of what they have now as the West Bank. Let's leave him there for a moment and bring in the other person who is on the scene of this, Anwar Sadat. You remember him as well. Nasser was, he didn't have quite as much street cred after the Six-Day War, and he died fairly soon. He's followed by Anwar Sadat, and while actually Israel is getting into some economic problems, high inflation rate and so forth, and their mind was on that. And while that's going on, Sadat organizes an Egyptian invasion across Sinai toward Israel. And of course, this time the Air Force didn't get bombed out on the ground. But so you had a good war going there for a while, and it looked like Israel could be even on the ropes. But the United States and various other countries moved in to help, and it got turned around, and the Israelis are able to push back and recover by the end all of the green parts of that map that you had seen. Let's just look at what's happened here. First, Arafat and his group have come up into the northern part of Jordan. See the arrow that I put up there? There. All right. And he was becoming so strong that the government of Jordan itself was threatened. And so 1971, in September, known as Black September, the Jordanian government attacked the Palestinian camps up north, chased them out, and they move up into southern Lebanon. Now remember, Lebanon's Maronite minority, but in the meantime, that minority has been getting less and less and less. The Sunnis and Shiites are just having more babies, for one thing. And now that really begins to shift things around. The Maronites don't want him there at all and really do some alliances with Israel to try to get him out. But the others, no, they're kind of pleased with what's happened. And so Lebanon breaks into its 1975 civil war that's going to continue off and on until about 1991. So that Black September is up there. Then you see a couple of years after that, you have the Yom Kippur War. This is Sadat's invasion that is finally turned around. Well, one of the things that did was to not only kind of scare Israel, but the Arab world had just been kind of humiliated by the Six-Day War. And they saw this as, even though they lost in the long run, they didn't feel like they lost it to Israel. And for them, it's one that they look back to as a heroic moment. And they call it the October War, or in Arabic, the Tishreen War. So depending who you're talking to, if you travel in the Middle East, if you refer to it as Yom Kippur War, that would be appropriate if you talk to one group. But if you're talking to Arabs, you might want to refer to it as the Tishreen War. Especially if you're in Syria and on Tishreen Street or in Tishreen Park or in Egypt in the Tishreen area of town. Well, you get what I'm saying. Later 1970s. Here you have a major turnaround in 1977. I said Israel was having economic problems as well as this war that they had gotten caught back-footed on. The Labor Party, which had been the main party all along, and somewhat moderate we would think of in terms of its relations with the Palestinians, is replaced by Likud Party. And Likud identifies as the prime minister, because it can choose the prime minister, Begin. I know you remember him. Now, Begin had been the leader of Irgun. Remember Irgun that I mentioned a little bit earlier? That they had, for example, bombed the King David Hotel. And I don't know whether he was part of the people, but the Irgun and the Stern group was the one that massacred a Palestinian village, Deir Yassin. It's kind of on the outskirts of Western Jerusalem now, and publicized this very much. And look, we're going to take this place, and you do well to move somewhere else. And that sort of thing figured prominently in the many Palestinians that left the country during the war. Likud's notion was greater Israel. They were not interested in negotiating any of the green territory back for peace. They saw an Israel at least of all the territory west of the Jordan River. And then there was a phrase from the Bible that you would see mentioned from time to time, from the river of Egypt to the great river. That would be the Euphrates. From Solomon's day. In other words, harking back to Solomon's time. So they come on river, but a couple of things they kind of have to deal with in between to slow down this move. But one thing, 1977, Sadat, who's just been defeated, announces that he's ready to go anywhere in the world, including Jerusalem, on a peace mission. See if we can work this out. Well, it's kind of hard to turn that down. I'm sure Begin, it's pretty obvious that Begin did not want to do it, but here's an offer that has to be taken seriously, and this is when Carter arranges the Camp David Conference. So you have the Camp David Conference. From the expressions on the faces, you can almost tell who's with it and who's not. But the agreement was that Egypt and Israel would make peace with each other. That was a pretty big thing. This is the first Arab country that not only has recognized Israel, but has made peace with Israel. And it wasn't too long after Sadat went home from this that he was assassinated. But the second thing is that Sinai would be returned to Egypt. Not the Gaza part, but the Sinai part. That's the reason Gaza was in purple in this other map that we saw. And Israel was going to withdraw from the West Bank within a 5-year span. Now that's where the uncertainty was. I can remember Julie and I watching TV, and I think, boy, that is great. 5 years, and there were not that many settlements in the West Bank or Gaza at that time, 5 years. But the next morning, he's in conversation. I've forgotten who the American journalist was. No, I didn't mean 5 years from now. I meant 5 years from when certain other issues are settled and so forth. Of course, these other issues still haven't been settled. So that's the way that one ended. The 1980s, throughout the 80s, I would call this the decade of the facts on the ground. Likud is controlling the government. Begin is followed by Shamir. You'll remember him, short fellow. And they are creating these facts on the ground. Encourage settlements throughout the West Bank and Gaza. Financial aid for them, facilitating them in different ways. They, of course, were controlling eastern Arab side of Jerusalem by that time, but now they officially annex East Jerusalem. And not only that, but then they extend the boundaries of East Jerusalem and extend it more than once since then, further and further into West Bank. They annexed the Golan Heights. And during this time, the Lebanese War is going on. So Israel has already invaded Israel at one point, just protecting that border up there. And in conversation, as I say, with Maronite Christians, who did not want Arafat and his group up there. Now they invade for a second time. How many of you remember the Sabra Shatila massacres? A Palestinian camp or village it had become in the southern part of Lebanon, just massacred in a brutal and ugly way, and there were photographs on television and in everything. It was a pretty ugly thing. The Israelis didn't do this. They kind of protected the outside area. It was the Maronite Christians who went and did this against the Palestinian camp that was there. Remember, I said, if you decide who's the good guys and who the bad guys, kind of make sure you get all the information straight as you move along here. But the other thing that the Israelis did was to flush Arafat out. So he leaves and goes over with his officers and settle in Tunisia. So he's out of the way there. Facts on the ground. By the end of the 1980s, you begin to have a grassroots, hometown Palestinian resistance emerging. Arafat, you see, had left, was over in Jordan, other places like that. You had other Palestinians that were in Syria or here or there. But these are Palestinians that are living inside the West Bank, inside Gaza, and they, even if they have citizenship, it's more and more difficult to live. And they're trying to resist in some way. These are the leaders. Mubarak Awad at the top is the one that was getting most attention in the early 80s. And he was from Bethlehem. And his approach was a Gandhi approach. He was trying to convince the Palestinians to begin a boycott in the sense that Gandhi had done and was making some progress. Hanan Ashrawi is still active. You hear her, watch her on television from time to time. She had been dean of a little Palestinian college, Birzeit College, just north of Jerusalem in the West Bank. The other two are dead now, I think. Husseini was just a very prominent Palestinian Jerusalem family, and Dr. Hada Abdul was a doctor from the Gaza Strip. So they're getting a good deal of traction. And I got to tell, even in the United States, people were thinking, well, they got something going there. In 1988, Mubarak was exiled from Israel. And 1990, 91, the Gulf War. Well, if you remember, in the Gulf War, well, for one thing, many of the Palestinians thought, well, Saddam Hussein is giving it to them, so they had hopes with him. So maybe this was no official hopes, but at least one television clip that went on and on and on. It seemed like every time you turned on TV at this time, there were Palestinians dancing in the streets, favoring Saddam Hussein and that sort of thing. So this movement just really kind of began to collapse. Right after the war, there are two peace negotiation processes, one in Madrid, one in Oslo. Now, the one in Madrid was sponsored by Spain and the United States, and much of the negotiations were trying to get the thing started, trying to get the Israelis and Jordanians and Palestinians to agree on who has a right to be negotiating. The Israelis would not allow Palestinians, because for them, the Palestinians that we have, that's our business, that's not yours. So the agreement was that Palestinians could be a part of the Jordanian delegation. But not Palestinians from East Jerusalem, because no, we have annexed East Jerusalem. It's not recognized internationally, but they can't be there. So anyhow, this was going on, and they began to do some kind of talking, but we find out, surprise, even to the United States, I'm convinced, that Israeli leaders, senior moment, anyhow, the negotiation between Israeli leaders and Arafat, who's over in Tunisia, with the PLO. And so they come up with a peace process that simply eclipsed any of the negotiations that are underway in Madrid. And there is signed then in 93 what has come to be known as the Oslo Peace Accords, or a peace process that was supposed to move forward at that time according to the Accords, which I'm going to review just in a minute. But I do want to say then that Jordan immediately, the next year, said, okay, looks like you're going somewhere, and they gave up any claim to the West Bank, with the exception of what Christians and Jews generally refer to as the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, but has been what Arabs call the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, because it has been Muslim holy ground, and the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Dome of the Rock, that big golden dome that you have seen photographs of. And part of the agreement was that Jordan would retain guardianship of that. And Jordan would actually administer it through the Waqf, which is a Muslim organization for maintaining mosques and that sort of thing. So things are real hopeful. I can remember talking with Palestinian friends. They were just very hopeful what's going to happen here. Here are the accords, and here's the agreement, and it's important because much of this is still in place, even though the process didn't happen. First off, right at the beginning, mutual recognition. The PLO is now going to officially, which they did, recognize Israel as a legitimate state. Israel, on the other hand, is going to recognize the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. See, we're not talking about this grassroots crowd. They are bypassed. But the PLO is that. The West Bank is going to be divided into zones. You already have now a lot of settlers there, and a lot of the land that is really heavily Israelized, even though theoretically that was part of it. Do you see, wait a minute, jump ahead there. All right, I think I'm doing pretty well with this new. All right, you see the little pink areas? That's Jericho, that's Ramallah, that'll be Nablus, probably Tulkarm. Anyhow, these are places where there's dense, concentrated Palestinian urban centers. These are the places that's going to be Zone A, and they're going to be even now, beginning now, under Palestinian administration. The yellow is going to be Zone B. Those are areas that, assuming the arrangements work out and you have a good, strong Palestinian administration going, you could potentially move into those areas. But the gray part, now that's Zone C, that's Israeli, and that's going to be Israeli. Now, the next part, though, to administer Zone A and move into Zone B, you're going to establish the Palestinian Authority. Right now, we talk about Fatah, talk about PLO, now we're talking about the Palestinian Authority. It's going to have administrative responsibilities of these areas, of course, only internal responsibilities, not outside, because all of this is still Israeli military area. And who's going to be the head of that? Arafat. So the Israeli government brings Arafat and his officers. I can't talk about this a little bit personally in here. I'm going to call them henchmen. I think that's the word used because that's the kind of government they brought back. They're going to come back and be the head of the PLO. I'm sorry, the head of the Palestinian Authority. So Arafat comes back, he's head of Fatah, he's head of PLO, he's also the head of the Palestinian Authority. And so the peace process is such they're going to move on forward, and if things go well, the Palestinian Authority can branch and spread out into the yellow areas and so forth, and we've got a good arrangement going here. Well, peace process stalled. It didn't go anywhere. It's like Rabin, my senior moment a minute ago, that has been in there negotiating this. You remember Rabin was assassinated in 1995. Of course, in 93, Jordan removes the West Bank in 94. He's assassinated in 95. Followed briefly by Perez, but then in the next elections that were called, Netanyahu, who represents Likud, comes back into prime minister role. Likud had been opposed to this peace agreement from the beginning. Netanyahu will have nothing to do with it, and he begins to increase settlements in West Bank, in Jordan. The Golan is in Israeli hands also, and the same kind of things are happening there, but they're a little bit out of the current arrangement because of things like that. So I don't mention them, but similar things are happening there all along. So the peace process is going nowhere, and but the Israelis are not quite satisfied with this either. And another military hero, Barak, is able to win the next round of elections. And Barak really had one main theme in mind, but he's mentioning another, pointing out in his during the campaigns. One is he wants to get the Israelis out of Lebanon. You may remember the Lebanese are controlling the southern strip of Lebanon. He said, I'm going to pull them out, and once he got elected, he did. Second thing, he is beginning to recognize an issue that is emerging, that while the Israelis are able to kind of block any peace process that would produce an independent Palestinian political entity, the Palestinian numbers are still increasing. And at some point, you're going to have to decide, and this is the terminology used, whether Israel's going to be a Jewish nation or a democratic nation. Because if the Palestinians ever get a voice in government, it's going to be like the South had the Civil War. So he is elected. One of the first things he does is to pull out of Lebanon. But then toward the end of Clinton's time, and it turns out toward the end of his own also, he and Clinton bring Arafat in on one more Camp David summit. And I know all of you are old enough to be reading the newspapers by this time and remember how that collapsed. And I'm sure you remember and have heard over and over since then, the explanation is, well, they offered him the moon and he walked away from it. Obviously, he's not interested in peace at any price. That's that. Well, the other side has a very different spin. I'm a little bit more inclined to do that, just to be. They said, no, what you're offering is just another round of peace process. We've been there and done that. What you're offering is, you're not really offering it, it's potentially offered if we, get our act together and do this and do this. But there was also a poison pill, a really poison pill. And that was that Israel was going to become officially in control of the Temple Mount Aramasharit. Julian will remember, we were talking about that. That's like an Italian politician negotiating away the Vatican. It's not his to do, and Julian will remember, I said he'll be assassinated by midnight. No way this is going to happen. So it fell apart. And that moves us then to the 2000s and beginning with the Sharon years. Sharon now is also a military hero, much more hawkish. Wasn't a coup, though he'll change parties later on after that. And picking up on the feeling in Israel at this time, he and several hundred Israeli soldiers, approximately 1,000, perhaps more, the estimates are different, go up on the Temple Mount and then do a kind of a symbolic worship service, which was not a part of the negotiations with the Jordanians. It was just like doing a middle finger in your face to the Palestinians and to the Muslims. This is ours. Well, as they are leaving, stones already begin to throw from Palestinian teenagers and youngsters around, and this breaks into the second Intifada. Barak's credibility is shot. He calls elections, and in February elections 2001, Sharon is elected prime minister. And so Sharon then, he begins what he referred to, or the way it gets translated into English, as the iron fist policy. Just tightening up, and putting down any intifada or any other kinds of opposition. But the second intifada gets more violent. And Hamas, which had just begun as an organization in the first Intifada and hadn't played any role in it, now begins to play a major role in this one. Also other organizations, more fundamentally Muslim, Islamic Jihad is one of these. Suicide bombers, you remember, are going off. Bombs are going off in shops in East Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv even. Real fights are taking place in different places. Sharon, begins building a security wall around the West Bank. Not exactly around it, but pretty much close to what had been the Green Line, they call it, the borders of the West Bank. You can see that kind of how it looks like from an angle. And also, in 2005, he withdraws settlers from Gaza Strip. I mean, that comes as a surprise from Sharon, and I think most other people. But remember what Barak had pointed out. We've got this large number of Palestinian population. We need to cut down on those numbers. And Gaza, we can get them out of the story already at this point. Though, as it turns out, well, I'll get back to that later. And then he has a stroke. 2006. He has a stroke. He's followed by Olmert, who had get ahead of myself. I'm glad I've got these notes up here. Let's talk about what's happening among the Palestinians while Sharon is doing all of this. In 2003, the United States and also the quartet, remember, including the European Union and a couple of other outside figures, and Israel pressure Arafat to make Mahmoud Abbas prime minister. And he was a more moderate kind of person. Arafat was beginning to get ill also. In 2004, Arafat is by this time confined just to his capital, Ramallah, and then he dies. And he's succeeded then by Mahmoud Abbas as head of Fatah and head of PLA. And you have some fairly quick elections among the Palestinians, and he's elected as president of PA, Palestinian Authority. So you kind of think things are looking okay. But then, in 2006, you have parliamentary elections for Palestinian Authority. And this time, surprise, surprise, Hamas won the most seats. So they have the privilege then of identifying the next PA prime minister. And they identify Ismail Haniyeh, who's going to be that. But then the United States, Quartet, Israel, say absolutely not. You Palestinians really depend on us for support one way or another. And for example, taxes go first to Israel and then are reimbursed to Palestinian Authority. You won't have it. And so Abbas appointed another prime minister, Fatah. Before you know it, there are street fights in the Palestinian areas between Hamas and Fatah. At the end of that fighting, Fatah has been able to hold on in the West Bank, but Hamas has taken the Gaza Strip. And Hamas, they're into this military stuff. It wasn't just a pleasant getting everybody to agree. It was some pretty terrible things that happened when they took over the Gaza Strip. But they were there and they are there. One of the follow-up things immediately after that is that both Israel and Egypt didn't have much Hamas either, agreed to blockade the Gaza Strip. Nobody can come in, nobody can go out unless you get pretty heavy permits, and the Gaza Strip is still blockaded. Well, now, Olmert, it was a short time. Had a border war with Hezbollah. This is the Shiite party in Lebanon, the first Gaza conflict. Then he had corruption problems, ended up doing time. So he's followed by Netanyahu again, who's going to be there for the next 14 years that we've just finished. I think by this very fast because you all remember it very well. Remember, right? First, Obama got him to slow down settlements for 6 months to do some negotiating. The Negotiations didn't get started until the end of that time. Largely Palestinians could not get their act together. And at the end of that time, Netanyahu said, all right, time's up, and began the settlements again, really fiercely. 2011, Arab Spring, other things began to take attention away from the Palestinian issue, both in the U.S. and international world. Fatah and Hamas decided they were going to unify and have elections. Didn't work. They've decided at least twice since then, still hadn't worked, and probably won't. The Palestinians requested recognition as a state of the United Nations. The United States blocked that because it had to go to Security Council. And then the General Assembly, though, in 2012, upgraded them from permanent observer status to non-member observer status. Then John Kerry, remember, he made an attempt, and that completely failed. We got another Gaza war. Netanyahu gets involved in U.S. politics and aggressive the U.S. Well, we're not even thinking about Palestinians anymore. The Trump years are just behind us. And you remember, he turned over the Palestinian issue to Jared Kushner and appointed as ambassador not just a pro-Israeli, but a pro-settler Israeli as our ambassador. Let me click through things here. The U.S. recognized Jerusalem as capital in 2017. We shut down the Palestinian office in Washington and ended any contributions to the Palestinians in 2018. The U.S. They stopped aid to the Palestinians. Although this is not totally in my focal range. They recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights to 19. And Israel Knesset passed the nation state bill. This is a very important turning point in the Abraham Accords. Okay, a new group's just come on. Before saying anything about them, there's not much to say. Let's just summarize where the Palestinians are. First, you have about 2 million of them that have a kind of second-class citizenship in Israel. And you can see from the map to the right, the darker the green, the more dense that group is. You see that many of them are up in the Galilean area. During the recent disturbances, you begin to have street fights between these and their Jewish neighbors. You see, they're all citizens of Israel, but the Jewish citizens, a lot of them are younger fellows, and the Arab or Palestinian citizens. Here's the West Bank. It's divided into zones. If you can make out the little dots in the middle map, those are all Israeli settlements now. You can see it's impossible to divide out what would be an independent Palestinian state. And then those red lines are settler-only highways. That is, you have to be a settler and have to have a right tag number. If you're a Palestinian on one side of the road, you can't visit Angelina on the other side unless you go around to where there's a checkpoint that you can get permission to come in. And the red shows where the wall, the security wall, is being built. You can see it dips in to the West Bank to get things. Settlements is a kind of euphemism. You generally think it's something like this, and they often begin that way, just a little basic camp, but very quickly they are towns of this sort, often situated on hills. As you drive through the West Bank, here you can see them up. Then some of them become cities. And I'll mention in a minute how some of the largest settlements are being placed like a ring around East Jerusalem to cut off East Jerusalem from the West Bank. And the one you see up here on the hill, Mullen, is an Israeli settlement on the east side of Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself, follow me on this map. This right here is the green line. It's that green line you see that separates what between 1948, 49, and 1967 was under Israeli control, New Israel, and then the area that was under Jordanian control. During that time, the Israeli city grew out into here, and the Jordanian city into here, and right at that point, some of you may have traveled, is the old city wall, the walled old city. And in it is the Temple Mount that is so much at stake. The Palestinians there, they've been annexed to Israel, and theoretically they have a right to become Israeli citizens also. But it's not just a simple thing. You have to show a good number of things, such as speak Hebrew, show how long you have lived in Jerusalem, and various other things. So it doesn't happen very much. But the main thing is, if they accept Israeli citizenship, that means that they are agreeing to annexation. And so few have. So they end up, and they also are not a part of the Palestinian Authority elections. So you see, they're people without a voting booth of any kind. Here, I realize I'm getting a little bit longer than I should, but here is that green line. Here's the old city. Here are the thick Palestinian settlements around, and then here are the Israeli large, really fortified settlements around East Jerusalem. The secure wall is to go out that far, and there's the old city, and Sheikh Jarrah is one of the real issue places right now under discussion. You can see where it is located. Settlements are being squeezed inside the old city. This is one, it's really on a roof, but it's inside the city walls, typical settlement there. And then, of course, the Gaza Strip, where you have just a thick concentration of Palestinians that are under Hamas rule, where they want to be or not, but they're blockaded from the outside world. It is really like being in an open-air prison that's run by an inside gang. It is what it's like. Well, what lies ahead? Two-state solution, that is long since been off the picture. I mean, you hear talk about it, but basically, I don't think anybody takes that seriously. It's just a way of kind of keeping the can down the road. You can say, well, we're going to do that one day. Is it going to be a democratic state or a Jewish state? I think that one is long since settled, but it was affirmed illegally now with that nation-state law that has just been passed. The new government that has just come in, all of you have been reading about this, I'm sure you know that it's so tight, has such a little margin of flexibility, and it covers just about everybody. Don't expect any kind of major changes for there, and I don't think the Palestinians are part of the U.S. front burner at the moment. But this is a little bit different. This is the first one in Israeli history that has a Palestinian party included. That's a kind of new. And the Palestinians are separated into these different segments that I just described. So I think the approach, and I'm using other terminology, is for the future, at least for foreseeable future, they'll be managed rather than any kind of movements coming from any direction to make any change. But I'll look at numbers. This is my last slide. Just to think about this. There are two ways of counting population. You'll hear tonight in newspapers and newscasts and so forth that about 20% of Israel are Palestinian. That's 20% of those that have some citizenship. Those are the Palestinian Arabs, or the Arab-Israelis. But if you point or count all of those who are either under Israel's rule and have been for over 40 years, paying taxes to Israel, or are blockaded, you talk about 12 million. Figures are hard, but already in 2018 and 2019, the projections were that already at that point, it was a majority Palestinians. And now, surely, we've passed the 50%. I grew up in Mississippi, got the vote under our Jim Crow laws. I showed that I was able to understand the Constitution, pay poll tax. If I hadn't understood it, the man who was checking me in would have helped me understand it. Blacks were kind of their citizens, but they weren't a part of it, didn't have any voice. And now, goodness, 60 years later, they have a voice, but the scars are still there. Our African American population is about 20-21%, not like the Israeli. But we're talking here about a majority of folks that at this point don't have a voice in government and be managed.
If I were given a chance to say, all right, here's how we're going to do it. Here's how we're going to do it. I don't think I could come up with anything that would work. What looks like to me is that both sides simply have painted themselves into a corner. And you've got some heroes on both sides. You've got some bad judgment on both sides. That's where we are. I'm sorry, I spent so much time talking here, but that's what happens when you... That's what happens when you call in a prof to talk. Now,